Wide receivers are flying off the board in early fantasy drafts. On average, the top 24 are going 5 picks sooner than they were last season. And by the end of round 4, as many as 27 could already be taken in your fantasy draft based on the latest average draft position data. With that type of early run on the position, if we want to succeed in 2023, we must have options we've identified that we think can exceed value in the later rounds. Well, here's the good news. There are 5 wide receivers going in round 6 or later that have the upside to help us offset the early wide receiver avalanche and smash our drafts. So the first name we're going to focus on today is Diontae Johnson from the Steelers, who is going in round 6 and 7 of drafts. But before we get into that, just a little bit of background on how I went about this exercise. The number one thing that I care about for wide receivers is their ability to earn targets. It's really just a good measurement of how good they are. Unlike running backs, where you turn around, you hand the ball, 9 people block for you, volume can be king. But to be good at wide receiver, you have got to be good enough to earn targets. The second factor is the ability to earn air yards, which really goes hand in hand with targets. But those are the 2 factors that really are the most repeatable year over year, and they correlate highly to fantasy production. And then finally, in a distant third, we have the player's team environment. So do they have a good quarterback? Do they play with a bad quarterback? Is there a lot of competition for targets? Is the target competition low? And then finally, are we on a team that we expect to pass a lot, or is it going to be a run-heavy offense? With all of that said, let's return our attention to Diontae Johnson. And he absolutely smashes in the target earning department. He had a 25% target share last year. That is a number that he hit the year before as well. And guess what? That is wide receiver 1 worthy when comparing to the rest of the league over the last 10 years. That brings us to our second category of air yards, where he earned a 33% share for the Steelers last season. That is also wide receiver 1 worthy, and also another category where it wasn't his first time to produce those types of results. Quarterback is definitely a question for the Steelers with Kenny Pickett. However, he was only a rookie last season, so there's a chance that he takes a step forward. But even if he doesn't, get this. The average number of touchdowns scored for a wide receiver with at least a 24% target share is 6.2 since 2011. These 2 are definitely due for regression. And finally, that brings us to the target competition in Pittsburgh. The Steelers do have some nice young weapons. However, there's still plenty of room for Johnson. Freiermuth had an 18% target share last season, and George Pickens had a 15% target share. Even if those guys take slight steps forward, there's room for Diontae to still push for 24 to 26% of the team's targets. Diontae Johnson is an absolute smash pick in round 6 and 7 for your fantasy drafts. Right now, I have him projected between 140 and 150 targets, which means he should be going in the 4th round, not the 6th. So that brings us to our second candidate, and that is Marquise Brown for the Cardinals, also going in round 6 and 7 of your fantasy drafts. And we have the departure of DeAndre Hopkins. And guess what? Last year in games without DeAndre Hopkins, it was a 26% target share for Marquise Brown. Secondly, a 37% air yard share. Oh my. The wide receiver 1 average for the last 3 years is 31%. So this is a guy that can truly attack every area of the field. He can hit the big plays, and he can earn the targets. Please sign me up for some Marquise Brown. I know. I see some of you looking sideways at me right now, and you're screaming, Dwayne, what about the quarterback situation? What if the Cardinals are terrible? Kyler Murray doesn't start the year. What if they just put him on the shelf so they can tank for Caleb Williams? Guess what? That's certainly in the range of outcomes, but I think we're really piecing a lot of things together for that to happen. And there's a good chance that Murray's actually ready for the beginning of the season. We've seen guys like Joe Burrow come back from worse injuries that occurred late in the season before. And guess what? Yeah, Kyler might not run that much, but he could still support weapons like Marquise Brown. And that brings us to the last factor, target competition. And the Cardinals just aren't deep. Rondale Moore is a very solid option, had an 18% target share last season in games played. Then after that, Zach Ertz is going to be 32 years old almost. Wasn't very good last season. We've got Trey McBride, who I had high hopes for as a rookie, but only had a 12% targets per route run. Then we look at Michael Wilson, their third-round draft pick out of Stanford. While some folks are really big on Wilson taking over a role in the Cardinals offense, whether or not that happens, he was not a high-end target earner in college, and I don't expect him to hold off Marquise Brown. So what does this all mean? This means in rounds 6 to 7 of your fantasy draft, you can get a wide receiver projected between 130 and 140 targets. And guess what? He scored 15.4 fantasy points per game in 8 contests last season without DeAndre Hopkins. That makes him an absolute value. So that brings us to our third wide receiver value, and that is Treylon Burks from the Tennessee Titans, and you can get him in rounds 7 and 8 of your fantasy drafts. So Burks was the first round pick for the Titans in 2022. He had a 17% target share in his rookie season. Some will look at that and think, wow, that sounds a little bit low. And it does on the surface. However, when you look in the games he played, he only participated in around 69% of the passing plays, but his targets per route run was 21%, which is wide receiver 3, borderline wide receiver 2 worthy over the last 10 years. So simply put, with Burks, as he gets on the field more, we're going to have the opportunity for more targets. That brings us to the second component, his air yard share, which was at 29%. That is already wide receiver 2 worthy as a rookie. Most of the questions around Burks really do tie to his environment. We know the Titans want to be a run-first offense, and we do have some questions around Ryan Tannehill. However, Tannehill was playing through an injury last season, and it wasn't very long ago that he was supporting wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2 finishes over a 3-year stretch for A.J. Brown. And one of Tannehill's favorite throws are on the in-breaking routes off of play action, which is somewhere where Burks can truly succeed. Get the ball into his hands, let him get the yards after the catch, which is really his strong suit, and let him rack up the fantasy points. So finally, that brings us to the target competition in Tennessee. We do love Chig Okonkwo at tight end. However, it was on a small sample last year. Probably not a big enough threat to think, oh my gosh, we can't have Treylon Burks. In fact, there's room for both of these guys to be in the 20, 22, 23% target share range, and they could be successful, especially given their average draft position. The next thing we have is Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. He is really just a backup. And then we have Kyle Phillips, who's an okay target earner, but he plays slot in an offense that likes to use a lot of 2 tight end sets and even use the fullback. So Burks offers you the opportunity to draft a player in round 7 or 8 that is so young. There is so much upside here. Even if he stays around where he was last year from a targets per route run standpoint, as long as he's on the field for starter snaps, he's probably a lock for 105, 110 targets. But if he takes a step forward as a target earner, that number could quickly balloon to 130. That brings us to our fourth value selection, and that is Nico Collins, who you can get in round 12 or later of your fantasy drafts. Collins took a nice step forward in his second year, earning an 18% target share. But guess what? There is room for more. That was on a 75% route participation, and his targets per route run was actually 22%. That means from a target earning perspective, Collins has already got that wide receiver 3 profile we're looking for. And guess what he did from an air yard standpoint? He was actually at 33%, which is wide receiver 1 worthy compared to his peers over the last 10 years. The Texans brought in C.J. Stroud in the first round of the NFL draft, and he is battling Davis Mills for the starting position. The positive for me in this situation is we already saw Collins take that step forward with Davis Mills. If Stroud outplays him and wins the job, that just provides us with upside for more yards in the Texans' passing attack. And if we look at the target competition in the wide receiver room for the Texans, things are really wide open. I think it's going to be hard for Nico Collins to not get to that 90% route participation we discussed earlier. You've got Robert Woods, who will be 31 years old, probably starts opposite of Collins to begin the year. We've got John Mechie, who's a great story recovering from leukemia, but we haven't seen him on the field yet. And then we have Tank Dell, one of Pete Overzet's personal favorites, but he only weighs 165 pounds. It's hard to see him taking over a full-time role. So really, when we look at Collins, his biggest competition doesn't come from the wide receiver room. It comes from the tight end room, where the Texans added Dalton Schultz. And while Schultz is a guy I think is going underdrafted right now in fantasy football, he's also not someone that's going to suddenly turn into a 25% target share guy, meaning there is room for both to succeed this year in fantasy. So when we really put the puzzle all together, we have a wide receiver that if he gets to that 90% route utilization, even if he takes a step back in the target earning department, let's say he gets a 21% targets per route run instead of the 22 he had last year, that puts him in the ballpark of 110 targets. But the upside is still 120 to 125 if he takes a step forward as a target earner. And that makes him an absolute smash in round 12 or later of your fantasy drafts. For our final wide receiver value, we go back to the Arizona Cardinals and we discuss Rondale Moore. Moore was the second round pick of the Cardinals in the 2021 draft. And get this, last season in plays where DeAndre Hopkins was not on the field, but he and Marquise Brown were together, he had a 24% target share. I get it. We can't just look at that sample and drop Rondale Moore into those targets this year. We've got coaching changes going on. We've got Drew Petzing coming over from the Browns, really from that Stefanski tree, and he is going to be taking over play calling duties. However, when I look at the roster, I don't see a team that can really play a lot of heavy personnel. I think it's going to be tough to keep a guy like Rondale Moore, who has proven that he can earn targets off the field. Like we discussed before, Hollywood Brown's the clear number one here, but we've got questions around Zach Ertz and an injury. We've got Trey McBride, who's really a receiving profile as a tight end, not someone that's going to cause you to run a ton of 12 personnel. And then we've got Greg Dortch, who could battle for some of the slot routes, and Michael Wilson, who did not perform well in the wide receiver rookie supermodel. And furthermore, in the games where Rondale Moore was active, he actually handled a 95% route participation last season, playing on the inside and playing on the outside. So when we add everything up around Rondale Moore, yeah, maybe we don't see that 95% route participation, but guess what? Even if it's at 75%, he would project for almost 100 targets. If he does manage to stay on the field for most of the plays, let's say he was able to get to 90% route participation, you have the upside for 125 plus targets, and you're getting it after round 12 in your fantasy drafts.